In this video we'll be revisiting 3D Studio Max and we'll be doing some quick refresher exercises. So in this case we'll be building a still life, and really this isn't a step-by-step how-to but more of an overall quick start if you haven't been using 3D Studio in a while. So let's get to it. This actually reminds me of a freelance project I completed not so long ago where I actually had to create a simple 3D still life for a client, and so I'll be using some of these items as inspiration for this quick refresher course. Let's start out then by looking at some inspirational images that I gathered before creating this still life, and really you can see I'm just trying to go for a mixture of themes. And in particular I'm interested in the flower on this one, and I'm looking to recreate the wood finish, perhaps the background, the wall, and also the sense of sunlight that's coming in through the window to light up this scene. It's always important to have this plan and set of images or sketches that you've done so you know exactly what it is you're trying to create each step along the way. So jumping into Max, the first thing we need to do really is actually set up our project folder. So I'm going to go to my application menu, I'm going to go down to my manage tab and then set project folder. From here I'll set my location, and you can see I've actually already created my folder. I just called it still life and click OK. And then Max is going to go ahead and populate that with some useful folders for organizing our content. I'll start then by saving my scene, so just save as, and I'm going to overwrite this existing copy that I have here. And I think what we'll do is we'll begin by creating some simple geometry, such as either a plane or, in fact, I think I'll use a box. This will be the easiest way to get started. And this really is going to form the foundation of my room. So I'll hold down Control, and in my top view click in the middle of the scene and drag out, and that's going to form the general shape, and then lift up, and there you've got the height of my room. So there we go, pretty easy. And once we've done that, we'll need to actually allow ourselves to easily see in this room. Now I could be zooming in and out to see inside the cube, but that's really a little frustrating. So what I'm actually going to do is remove one of these sides, and that's going to act as a little viewport for us to look through. So let's go to our Modify tab, and while we're at it, let's rename Box 01 to Room. And obviously we've got our creation parameters here, length, width, height, and segments, and that's only going to get us so far. But while we're at it, let's take a look at wireframe view, and you'll notice that we've only got one quad per face. Now what I'll ultimately be doing is adding a window in the side here to let some light in. So why don't I actually start by adding in some divisions that I can later use to cut out one of those faces quite easily. So let's add some, well, we don't really need length segments. Let's do 2 width and 2 height. And what I'll later do is I'll adjust these here and then cut this panel out so that I have a room or a window so my light can shine in. And once I've done that, what I'll probably do is switch back to realistic mode and actually apply a modifier to this so I can do more than just adding segments and changing the size. So I'll hit E, and that brings up most useful modifiers here. I'd say I use these more than anything else. And I could do an edit mesh, but I prefer to do an edit poly. It's just that much easier when it comes to working with quads. The next thing I need to do then is actually use a sub-object selection mode to select either the vertices or the faces, the quads, the edges of this shape. So let's see, let's go to vertex selection mode. You see they all pop up here. Let's do this in wireframe mode. I need to resize one of these openings here so that it's more of a general window shape. So what I'm going to do is I'll grab a selection of vertices, and we'll start by just quickly resizing this into, a window shape. Grab the horizontal ones to set the height, and then let's move these over And this is going to be the somewhat large window for my room. Let's go to polygon selection mode, grab this face on the side, and simply tap delete. And we've just created ourselves an opening for our sun to shine through. And while we're at it, let's grab that viewport that we talked about earlier. I'm just going to hold down Control to select multiple polys, tap delete, and I've got a viewport into my room. Now before we continue and get ourselves in a bind later on, it's worth talking briefly about the normals. If you remember, the normals are little vectors that point out perpendicular to our surfaces here that define the front and back of the surface that we're looking at. Now by default the normals face outwards from the cube that I've created, but of course I'm going to be looking from inside this cube. Now what does that mean at render time? Well, if I use mental ray, then my walls are going to disappear, because at render time it's only going to render the outward pointing normal. You can turn on double-sided rendering, but for this example it's worth noting that that is going to slow things down considerably when you render. So it's a good habit to make sure that your normals point in the right direction. In order to quickly look at which way the normals are facing, let's just do a edit mesh modifier quickly and come down here, go into polygon selection mode, and let's go to show normals. If I select my polys, you'll see my normals are all pointing out, which means that the front face or the render face is on the outside. So I need to reverse this. We'll then apply a normal modifier, so n normal, and you'll see that by default my flip normals is turned on, and that just flips them so they're facing correctly to the inside. So just a quick tip to remind you about using normals on your objects. And once we've done that, we can actually delete this edit mesh modifier and our normals will still be facing the correct way. Right, we've got our scene set up. Let's actually create some geometry then for our objects. I think I'll start by creating a very simple desk which we can place some of these objects on, and this will give us a great chance to quickly revisit simple geometry, beveling edges, and doing some UV setup and texturing. Let's temporarily hide this room then while we create the object, because this is really just going to be a distraction. So if you remember, we'll go to Tools and we'll use our Scene Explorer to do this. So I'll just create a new Scene Explorer, and you can see my room here. And what I like to do with my Scene Explorer is just go to the Customize tab, Configure Columns, and then you can select additional columns to add, and one that I find very useful is Hidden. So just drag this over into our columns, and it's very easy to just show and hide your objects using your Scene Explorer, so that's just very handy. We'll begin by creating the top of our chest of drawers, and rather than using a polygon primitive straight away to do this, I think I'm actually going to switch to a spline instead, and I'll create a simple rectangle, and let's turn on 3D snapping so that we can get something that is easy to work with later on. So let's use that for now, and let's go to our creation parameters, and maybe I'll change the length to 50 instead. And what's nice about using splines instead of polys is that you can instantly start adding curvature very easily. So let's look at this corner radius value, and as we start to increase this, you'll see how we can add this curve into our corner radius. And again, I'm looking at my reference imagery here. My reference imagery being this image here that we looked at earlier, and you'll notice that everything's nice and sanded and rounded, and it's it's all a little more natural. So I like to try and remove those hard edges from CG as much as I can, so that's a good starting point. I'll add a bevel modifier, and I'm going to turn off the defaults that I had already used when I was doing this before, so that we have a good starting point. I'll switch to my perspective view, and let's see how this works then. So the bevel modifier is really nice because you can instantly start to give height to your objects, and in addition to that we can add a second level of bevel, and you'll notice that I actually have curved sides turned on. By default you'll have linear sides, which is more like this. So curved sides again helps us with that rounded effect. Let's take this level 2, and you see we can bring this out or in. Let's bring it in to start with, and then we'll add a level 3 bevel, which is going to allow us to get that curve back again. Something like that. Perhaps that's a little too extreme, so I'll just decrease this a little bit. And this guy also. Maybe lower the height down just a little bit. I just want that kind of nice, neat, beveled edge that you might see on some furniture. So that's a good start. From here on out, I'm going to treat this as a polygonal object. So what I'll do is probably add an edit poly modifier to this, and you'll notice straight away that I can pick up my polygonal faces here, and I can edit this just like any other polygonal object. If you haven't already done so, I highly recommend that you actually change your viewport by clicking on the little plus symbol here, going to configure viewports, and turning on edged faces. I really prefer this method of modeling because it allows me to see exactly how my geometry is constructed, and it just makes it easier to work with. Moving on to the rest of this piece, it's going to be fairly straightforward. I think within the top view, I'm going to zoom in on the corner point here, and again create a rectangle. Maybe just give a little lip here, something like this, holding control to constrain those proportions. And again, let's take a look at the construction parameters here and increase that corner radius just to give a little bit of curvature, and apply a bevel modifier. I can turn off these other bevels here because I really only want to just extrude this effectively, but the bevel modifier works just fine to do that. So let's come back to our perspective view and bring this down so we can see what we're doing. And let's extrude this in the height. Let's go negative. And remember, my camera is going to be set up in such a way that I'm not actually going to see the lower part of this geometry. So I'm going to make an executive decision here to not model the rest of this piece, at least for this example. Once I've created one of these, all I need to do is switch back to my top view, Control V, make sure I'm set this to copy, and we'll just place these accordingly, roughly put these into place. Control select, Control V to copy, and put these guys into place also. That's pretty close. So there we go. Our model's coming together. And I think I'll go ahead and just use simple polygonal geometry here for the in-between sections, for the sides and the back. Although I don't really need to model the back, so I think I'll leave that out in this case. And then again, I'll add in some additional pieces to the top where the drawers will be, and some beveled surfaces for the drawers themselves. Now that I've completed the chest of drawers, you can kind of see what I've gone ahead and done here. I've actually just ended up using simple planes for the sides and the front down here, and I used actually a chamfer box here to create the drawers, or the drawer fronts I should say, so they also have that little sort of rounded effect, and lots of duplication and just careful placement. And the next thing I think we're ready to do is actually begin to apply some materials to these. Before we do that though, let's quickly revisit our Scene Explorer. So let's go to Open Scene Explorer 2, and this is a little bit of a jumble, and you can see I haven't been naming things here. I've got my room here which is hidden, but I think it would make more sense to group this together. Now, the way I like to do this is actually to create a dummy object. So I'm going to go to my helpers here and create a dummy, and I'll create that about the same size as the object itself. Maybe just move that into position. And you can use containers, but they're a little more than is actually needed for this, so dummies work well. And then what I think I'll do is rename this dummy to chest, and then select my geometry that's going to go inside this chest. So let's deselect this guy, and we'll just grab this from the actual icon and drag that into chest, and instantly we've got some nice scene organization. I can hide and show this as I see fit. So let's actually get on with some materials. I'm going to open up my Slate material editor, which is the new material editor for newer versions of 3D Studio, which I actually prefer. It reminds me a little more of the Maya material editor. And what we'll do is I think we'll just create a standard ray trace material. So double click this guy, and let's call this chest white. I'm not going to bother to UV this chest because I'm not actually going to apply any surface texture. Instead, I'm just going to use a simple Phong setup to get a shiny white, almost sort of painted effect on this surface. So we'll keep this at Phong, and we'll change the diffuse color to perhaps something a little whiter, maybe make it almost a little bit creamy. Select OK, and we can look at our preview here to see what this is going to look like. We can increase the specular level, bring this up, and we can make it glossier. You can see how my render here is starting to reflect this glossier surface. Perhaps not too glossy, not too shiny, just enough to give the idea of a painted effect. And I think softness at 0.1 is going to be just fine. So we'll go ahead and select these objects and apply the current material to those objects. And there we go. White chest of drawers. That's going to work just fine, I think. Let's select our dummy. And remember, we can scale our dummy down, and all of our items that are grouped inside that will scale easily. Let's bring up our Scene Explorer again and show our room and start to bring this object into place. We'll rotate it around 90 degrees here in Z. And bring it back. Z to zoom in. Scale this guy up a little bit. Not quite sure of my scale just yet. I'm just kind of placing these items in here to give me an idea. That's a fairly good start. And our chest of drawers is virtually complete. So what are we going to do next? If we take a look at these little pin boards that are in the background of our reference image, we could go ahead and create these really easily, and rather than actually spend too much time dwelling on the texture for this, I'll simply be creating the box and setting up the UVs and utilizing this image itself to work as the texture. And you could go ahead and build this texture out of reference material if you wanted to and make it much more higher resolution, but for the sake of speed I'm just going to keep going with this. So let's bring back our Scene Explorer again, and I think what I'll do is just hide my items because I'm going to start fresh with one of these pin boards. Again, this will be useful to chamfer, so why not use rather than just a standard primitive, let's use an extended primitive, just like I did with the draw fronts, and select a chamfer box. These are great for speed. Let's switch to our front view. So we'll simply click and drag, and I think that they're actually perfectly square. So we'll let go, move up just a little bit. You'll see my height adjusting there. You can't really see it in the front view. Just look at your parameters. Click again to define the height, and then lastly we define the fillet, which gives us this chamfered effect. So nothing too much, just a little bit, and that's it. We're done. We've created our chamfer box. Switch back to our perspective view, and this will work quite nicely, I think, for one of those pin boards. So next we actually have to UV this guy and get it ready so we can start working on a texture for it. Let's go ahead and select the item, go to our modifiers, and select one of the UVW options. Remember, UVW is our texture coordinate space, and it just allows you to differentiate from XYZ 3D space. Now for something simple like this, we could simply project a planar projection for our image to sit on the front of this, but you always get distortion along the sides. So why not add a unwrap UVW modifier here, and that gives us that much more control. If you remember, the actual unwrap UVW modifier is responsible for actually converting this 3D object into 2D space so that we can place a 2D texture and wrap it around this 3D object. What we'll actually do is open the UV editor, which is really kind of the nuts and bolts of this tool. And what you're actually looking at is the default UVs that are stored in this geometry. Currently, you can see it's just being projected straight from the front, and all of the remaining side and rear polygons are simply just being bunched together here. So that's a problem. The square here represents the texture, which we're going to be using later on. This is the size of the texture, and textures are typically square because graphics cards handle square textures that much better. So what's useful to know is that we've got this checker pattern here, and that's not there just to look pretty, it's really there to help you determine where distortion is occurring on your geometry. If you come up here to the checker pattern drop down and actually select checker again, you'll notice that your object now appears with these same checkers applied, and straight away you can see that it looks great from the front, but from the side, obviously because those UVs are all bunched together here, we're getting some awful bunching of our texture. So we need to fix that. What we'll actually use are 3D Studio's tools to explode and essentially separate out these different faces so that they all appear flat on the page, and then we'll go ahead and re-stitch them back together again. You can do this manually, but it's very laborious. So what we'll actually do is come down here to our sub-object selection mode. If you remember here, we've got our vertices, edges, and polygons. And to demonstrate how this distortion is working, we can just click on vertex, maybe select the vertices in the top left-hand corner, move these around, and you can see how as we distort the UV texture space, we distort the texture itself on the geometry. So let's undo that. I'm going to go to Polygon and just select all of my geometry here in my UV editor. And we've got several different options here for exploding this geometry out. And you'll notice that we've got facing angle, smoothing group, which is essentially just how you can smooth the surface normals to give the illusion of a smooth surface with lower poly objects. We also have material ID, because you can separate objects out to have multiple materials on the same object. And lastly, we have the ability to apply a custom explode. We're going to use facing angle, and this simply looks at how these faces here differentiate from these ones here in angle, and the greater the angle, the more likelihood there is of them being separated when it tries to place them in 2D space. Let's go ahead and click on that, and you'll see it's done a pretty good job straight away of dividing up this geometry. You can see that we've got our front and back, and our side pieces here. If we deselect at this point, let's actually go in further. The green edges indicate a seam, in other words, how the geometry has been divided in order to flatten it out. And those green edges also show in our 3D view. What's quite nice is that if we go into edge selection mode, select one of these seams, you'll see that the corresponding seam that should join up to it actually turns blue. So you can see that this piece here needs to join to this piece. Additionally, it's really easy to figure out where you are by going to polygon mode, selecting one of these faces, and you can see that, yeah, that's the back piece. This guy up here is the front piece. So it's easy to navigate your way around the UV editor. So why do we need to join this stuff up? Well, it's not too important in this case, but mostly in 3D you'll find that you need to wrap a texture around this object. And if your object is divided up like this, then when you paint your texture, you have to make sure that what you paint here, for example, let's find out which seam this joins to. What you paint here has to join up perfectly with what you paint here. So if you join it all together as best you can in your UV editor, you'll find your painting is that much easier. So there are several ways to join your geometry. While you're stitching this together, it can be useful to actually expand the size of your UV texture editor and utilize all of this space. And what I'm actually going to do is just move these out so I can really see how it's all joining together. And I'm going to make sure that my select by element UV toggle is on. So if I'm in polygon mode, when I select one of these polys, it actually picks up everything that's part of this element here. So let's just move some of this around a little bit. Let's just bring this guy here, here. We'll just start to separate these so we can really kind of see what's going on. Okay, that'll probably work. Now let's start by selecting, and I'll make sure I deselect that element toggle. Let's start by selecting one of these seams here. We can see that this is the corresponding seam on this side piece. We have various ways to stitch these together, and we can do stitch to target, which basically pulls from the source to the target. Let's undo that. We can do the reverse, or stitch to source here, goes the other way. Undo that, or we can go to the average, which sort of meets in the middle. And none of those are really very useful for this simple operation, so I like to use the custom one, which essentially takes the target and moves it to the source. Excellent. You can see how that stitched that together nicely for us. Now you're always going to get some kind of distortion because it's essentially trickier to join objects together in 2D space, especially when they're quite complicated 3D objects. Simple 3D objects are quite easy to do like this, but if you're doing something like a human head or a human body, you're going to have that many more seams. So let's grab this seam here, zoom out, joins to this one, stitch that. We'll do the same with this guy, stitch and stitch. So now we're just left with this piece here, which if I look, you can see is my front, and this piece here, which is my back. So we might as well just join the back on to the lower half here, just to clear up any loose ends. So let's zoom in, grab this seam, and stitch those two together. And that's it. You've correctly UV'd this. The last step is to make sure that it fits neatly inside of this texture space here. It's a bad idea to have your object so it's scaled too small because you're wasting texture space. All these pixels in your texture won't be used, and this will essentially be pixelated. You'll need a much larger texture to make up for that. And be sure that nothing sits outside of the texture space for obvious reasons. It won't get textured. So this really would be considered wasted space because I've got all of this space here, but I'm making the best I can out of this situation. What you could do is take the other pinboard that I'm going to model, and I think what I'll actually do is just place it into this right hand side of the texture space so that I can texture both of these pinboards with a single texture. So let's scale this down just a little bit and move this over, and then this guy is UV'd. So let's temporarily close this down, and what I think I'm actually going to do is just pick up my chamfer box, which really I should give a name, so let's do pinboard, and let's do a Control V to make a copy of this guy, pinboard 1, and I know that in my scene it's roughly placed here, something like that. Well, while we're at it, let's actually amend these UVs so that we can occupy our texture space correctly. So we'll come into our Unwrap UVW, open the UV editor again, and let's grab all of these UVs and move them over. And now what we can actually do, which is quite nice, is we can come out of object editing mode, we can pick up both of these objects, and you'll notice that we've lost the ability to edit the individual modifiers. But what we can do, because these do contain UVs now, is go to our modifier list, create another Unwrap UVW modifier. If we look at the UV editor again, you'll see that those UVs have been retained. So let's simply grab one of these and then the other one. I'm just moving them into place, and then it's probably a good idea to scale them up just so you're making maximum use of this texture. But try to avoid sitting directly on the edges of your UV space, because that can cause problems. It's always best to have a little bit of padding. And that's it. These guys are ready to go. What I will do actually is export this UV map so that it's easier to work with in Photoshop. So I'm going to go to Tools, and I'll bring this into view, Render UVW Template, and then we can set our size of this. Now, I don't have too many objects here, so I think I'm just going to simply do a 2K texture, which is a little bit excessive, but you can always resize it down later. And we'll leave everything pretty much at the defaults, and Render UV Template. You can see that's given me this simple black and white image here. And what I'll do is I'll save it and place it inside my still life, and I'll just call this Pinboard UV. As far as formats go, I'm just going to use a PNG, I think. Save on space, and it really only needs to be a 24-bit. Click on, we don't need the alpha channel. Click on OK, and we can now use that in Photoshop. In Photoshop then I have my UV map opened up along with my reference image, and I'm going to make this pretty quick and easy just for this example. I'm going to copy one of these pinboards and place this on my front here. And I remember the top is my front and the bottom is the back. And obviously I've got some real resolution issues here, so I might end up lowering the resolution of this final texture to maybe a 1K texture. I'll do Control T to resize this, and Shift and Alt to kind of roughly get this into place. Let's start with something like that. And then we need to address our ordering issue here. So I'm going to take my background layer, unlock it by double clicking it, and just select OK. Drag it to the top, and for blending modes I'll just come down here to a, let's see, screen. Now you can see if I zoom in that my UV lines are actually present on top of my drawing, which is on top of my photograph, which is nice. So what I think I'll do is actually use the transform tool again on this guy, and I'll right click and I'll go to distort. And this is nice because it allows me to bring the corners of this image into place like this. And I would say that's probably good enough for now. And I can actually go ahead and I'll just use my selection tool and delete out the stuff that I don't need right now. I'll do the same for the other pin board, and then I'll do some quick cleanup and probably reduce this down to a 1K texture, and then we'll go back into Max and actually apply this. And there's our final texture, and it's definitely not going to win any awards, and to be honest with you, if I were going to do this properly, I would firstly go high resolution, but also make sure to remove any of these specular highlights when you're editing this, because you really want all of these highlights to be generated in your 3D software and not baked into the textures themselves. I'm not going to bother actually creating the lower half of this because it goes against the wall, and so I'm effectively going to call this texture finished. So be sure to save a native PSD as well as your texture itself. So I'll resize this down and save it out. Back in 3D Studio then, let's bring back our slate material editor. We'll move our chest material off to the side, and because these actually aren't very shiny, these pin boards, I think what I'll actually use is a simple standard material. And let's zoom into this. Let's call this guy pin board. And what I need to do now is link in a texture file, the texture that I created, into my diffuse color. So I'm simply going to double click on that little diffuse color tab and select bitmap, and then locate the image that I created. You'll notice I've saved it as a PNG because these are great for saving file space. They are a little slower to use, and one thing to be careful of is not to use PNGs really when you've got anything that needs an alpha channel. If you save an alpha channel into the file, PNGs because of the compression they use, they will destroy their alpha channel, and Metal Ray tends to complain at these. So for the time being though, this is just a standard texture, so a PNG is fine. I'll click open and I'll select my geometry, it's already selected here, and I'll click apply to selected. Now I'm not seeing it in my viewport, obviously because I need to come to my display mode here. It's set to realistic, but if I come down to materials, you'll see I have the option to select realistic materials with maps at the bottom. If I select that, you'll see that my textures are applied, and we've got some, well, fairly rugged looking pin boards, but I wouldn't say they're that refined by any means. I've now scaled these into place and put them into the rest of my scene and placed them inside a dummy object. One thing to note here is that this dummy object is actually scaled 18, 18, 18, whereas the one that I created earlier on the chest of drawers was created or scaled non-uniformly. Now that's okay for something like this because it's a simple object, but when I came to actually rotate these objects, if I hadn't made the dummy object uniform in all directions, then I would have had some strange scaling distortion of my objects as I rotated them, and it's known as double deformations. So that's something to note. Whenever you create a dummy object, it's really best practice to make it so that it's uniformly scaled, so that you don't get any bizarre distortion happening when you rotate or scale objects contained within that. Finally, let's work on modeling some simple geometry such as this book here, and the reason I'm showing you this is just to give you a refresher on using the edit poly tools and doing cuts and slices, and just to show you how to create something a little bit more complicated. Let's start with a standard primitive. What I'll actually use is a box, and rotate this around roughly. Let's do something in the rough shape of a book. I think that'll work. What I'll then do is perform a series of cuts into this to start to divide it up so that we can create the look of a book with a spine and then pages in it as well. Let's move into our, well, let's do our front view. Bring this down and zoom in on this, and we'll apply an edit poly modifier to this. Once we're in this modifier, we can go into polygon selection mode. I'll just grab all of my polys, and what I'm going to do is place some cuts down the geometry. So let's go to our edit geometry section and do a quick slice. So I'll do a slice across the top here, a slice across the bottom. I'll right click to get out of that mode. Let's take a look at that in the perspective view. You can see how that's sliced down there. And then I think what I'll also do is slice this down the geometry from the top view as well. So we'll switch to our top view, do a quick slice, come in here, and I'll slice it, I think something like this and this. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'm adding detail to my corners, and what that will ultimately enable me to do is to apply mesh smoothing to this, and it'll retain its shape, but it's another method that you can use to get those nice beveled edges on an item like this. So additionally, I think I need to do one more, probably down the top here across the front and back. So let's come back to our top view, quick slice, down here, and down here. And it's always the way with 3D, there's a million and one ways to do the same thing. Some ways are better than others, and this is just a method I'm using for this book just to demonstrate some of these extra edit geometry tools under the edit poly modifier. Next, I'd like to create a little bit of separation between the pages that'll be here and the actual cover of the book. So what I think I'll do is just select these faces here that make up the pages for my book. There we go. And I'd like to extrude these in. In fact, I'll probably notice that if I use my extrude modifier, let's click on the settings, yeah, it's not quite going to behave like you want it to. And this would work. This would be okay. You could recover this. But perhaps instead of using extrude, let's try using inset. And we'll just bring this down a little bit. You can see that we're bridging this extra geometry in here. And this is going to be useful for creating the underside of these book covers. So we'll just accept that, and we'll do a little bit of modification using the scale tool. So I'll leave everything selected, and what I'll do is just scale this in that direction, and I think also, let's just move this back that direction. And it's probably a good idea if we use our left view to verify that this is aligning correctly. In fact, that's not the correct view to use. We should use the front view. We want to make sure that it's aligning correctly with this here so we don't get too much buckling there. So we'll just line that up, and then we'll use our scale tool again, and we'll just push these pages back up to straighten everything back out again. We come back out to our perspective view. You can see we've got those inner pages now. Excellent. Now when I start doing some smoothing on this, it's actually going to have an adverse effect on these pages because I don't want to smooth these pages. So what I think I'll do is actually separate these from the rest of this geometry so that my pages are their own separate unique item. In order to do that, I will scroll down in my modifier here to, let's see, we want edit geometry, and you'll see the option to detach here. So I'll click on the settings for that, and you can name it. So I can just call it pages, and you can detach to element, detach as clone, etc. But I'll just do the standard without these options. Click on OK, and now you'll notice my pages are actually separated from the rest of my geometry. Excellent. That's going to make life easier later on. The next logical step then would be to smooth this out so that we can actually get a more realistic looking book and something a little less Lego-like. So let's actually look at the smoothing options we have within the Edit Poly modifier. And first of all, let's just give this a go. Let's go to the settings, and you can see where we've actually subdivided or split that mesh. It works quite nicely on the corners there, but we have a problem here where there's not enough detail around the spine area. So let's actually cancel this, and let's grab our geometry, and what we'll do is create a new Edit Poly modifier to both of these pieces of geometry. Let's switch to our front view, and let's go to polygon selection mode, and let's pick up all of these pieces of geometry. Come down and make another quick slice. Let's do one here, perhaps another one here. I could always do one in the middle as well. You want to try and avoid adding more detail than you really need to. So we'll call that good. And now when we actually come to smooth this out, this will actually behave a little better because of the extra detail there. Remember, it's averaging out vertices, so if the vertices are far apart, then the averaging becomes more extreme. And when you start to cluster the vertices together, that's when the averaging becomes more friendly, and it's a little more like you'd expect it to be when you smooth something out. In the meantime, I think I'm actually going to smooth out this spine here, and also these pages at the front. Let's go to vertex editing mode, and let's grab these vertices and just do a quick slight rounding off of these of the spine, something like that. And let's also grab the pages here and just tweak them in a bit, just to give the illusion of these pages being folded together. Let's come back out to our perspective view. And the problem is, if we come back down to the original Edit Poly, we've lost all that detail that we added between both of these objects. And if we just added the mesh smooth, that's not going to work, even if we step back up again. So let's undo that, and let's just add another Edit Poly modifier. And apply the mesh smooth here. And there you go. You can see this is behaving a little better. You know, it's still not quite right. We're getting too much averaging here. So let me step back. And let's just grab this piece of geometry again. And come back to the front view. Select the geometry that we're interested in, and do another quick slice. So let's come down to here to edit geometry, quick slice, and let's just pop one straight down here. There we go. Now when we actually go back to regular object selection mode and apply that mesh smooth, because of this extra clumping of this geometry here, we're going to get something a little bit more predictable. In fact, we could actually grab these inner vertices here, push them in to just clump those together even closer. We'll come back down to mesh smooth, apply that, and you can see the geometry is behaving a little bit more like we'd expect it to. So that book's not looking too bad. I think really we're ready now to start getting this UV'd. But before we do that, it's worth noting that you're going to consume more memory and essentially slow down your machine, because you can think of this like a history, much like Photoshop's history. And each time you load the scene, it's having to rebuild all of these steps that we've done to build up this geometry. So there's often times when really it makes sense, when you're happy with the status of your geometry, to just go ahead and collapse the stack. So we can just shift select all of these here, right click and collapse all. Same with our pages, we can collapse the stack. Our geometry then is that much more refined, it's going to be more, it's essentially optimized, and from here on out we can go ahead and add the unwrap UVW modifier to each of these and UV it in much the same way that we did with the pin boards. So I'll go ahead and do that now quickly, just to get this done, and we'll revisit this when I'm finished. I've now finished the book and added the texture to it. You can see I've used the cover from Catch Me If You Can. And I also went ahead and added some kind of a low-res wallpaper texture and threw in this plant that I had created earlier. Just put some basic shaders on it. So essentially this is a starting point for a 3D still life, and really just for a refresher, I think that's all we need to add in this case. So the next thing would really be to add some lighting, a camera, and then to render this out. So let's talk about that next. Underneath my Create tab, I'm going to go to Cameras, and I'll just use a standard camera. And I think what I'll do is perhaps use a target camera. We'll switch to our top view and perhaps just drag in a camera, something like that. And the best thing to do really is to actually switch your camera using your viewport over to the one that you've just created, and then just use your standard viewport controls, sort of position this into place roughly. And we can always come in and perhaps let's convert this back to a perspective. And let's grab the target point of this camera. That gives us lots of fine control. Let's push the camera this way a little bit. Many people actually don't create cameras when they're creating rooms or still lifes, or even just doing a test render. It's incredibly useful because you never know when you're going to accidentally move your standard perspective camera. You can always fall back to a placed 3D camera, and you can even lock off the attributes so that you can't move it. It's really the best way to ensure that you're getting consistent results when you're actually doing multiple test renders. So let's move this back a little further. I think something like that might be a good start. You can always come in and tweak this later. Never underestimate the importance of good composition. So remember to save my scene, and we'll do a test render, and we're going to get some horrible results, but really the next phase is to add lighting. And you can't really talk about lighting and rendering in two separate instances. They really gel together, they belong together. You have to deal with both at the same time. So first of all, let's do a test render. I'm just going to click on Render Production, and here we go. I've just got a standard render, and it looks pretty awful. For the sake of this render, I actually quite like this framing in here. It kind of matches the square original composition that we had. So if you did want to change the render setup, though, you could just go to the Rendering tab, Render Setup, and change your resolution from there, and use a widescreen resolution and customize all of that. If ever you want to do animation, of course, this is where you set up your timeline range, but I'm just doing a single output here just to test it. So we'll close this down. The most important thing here really is that I want to start rendering with Mental Ray. I don't really want to use the scanline renderer for 3D Studio because it's just not as mature and it's not as effective. So let's go to our render preset and we'll start perhaps with Mental Ray, no GI, no global illumination. So no final gathering or anything like that. We'll load the presets and we'll do a render. I'll click render and see what it gives us. Okay, this is definitely rendered in a different way, but we're getting very similar results, but that's okay. It's kind of what we expected. So now it's time to move on to lighting. I'll move over to my Create tab and go to my Lighting sub-tab, and I think let's start with some standard lights, just as we're really just warming up here. We're not going to get any amazing results from this, but we should be able to get something that looks, fairly pleasing to the eye. We'll start perhaps with a free directional light because, well, I'm trying to represent the sunlight coming down here through the window. So let's just roughly place our directional light, and in our perspective view, let's come here and try and angle this sun so it's coming down. It's also useful to switch your viewport over to realistic as well. You can get a rough idea of where that sunlight's coming in. And at the same time, I might change this viewport to, instead of looking through a camera, I can actually look through my light. So let's look through that directional light, full screen that, and sometimes this can be a bit confusing because the light gets rotated and so the camera appears as though it's upside down. So let's just rotate this round so our scene makes a bit more sense. And then we can just use our standard viewport controls to position the camera, which is quite useful. Now perhaps I want a little more angle than this. And you might notice that my coordinates here on my rotation gizmo don't seem to make any sense here, and that's actually because they're set to view right now. So if I want to just rotate this up and down, it's not very easy to do it. So it's best to come over to your coordinate system here, and we'll change it to local, which is local to the light, and you'll see that suddenly my x-axis lines up with the direction of my light, and I can sort of angle this in, perhaps move it up, and I really want it to fill that window, so it might be worth scaling the light up. I think that might be a good start. Let's give this a render and see what we end up with. Okay, so pretty flat, nothing too drastic, but that's okay. Of course, the next step is to actually turn on some shadows here. So we have a couple of different options for shadows. I'll turn them on, and you'll notice now I can see in my realistic view, I can see that window shadow coming in. So I really want to change the angle of that. Let's go ahead and maybe do that now. Tweak this round. Maybe I'll switch to shaded mode here. There we go. I kind of like the way that's lining up there with that shadow being cast down, and it also kind of draws the eye into the contents of the table. So, do another test render and see what we get. Alright, interesting. So, why is this looking so harsh? Well, there's a couple of reasons. For one thing, we only have one light, so there's no bounce going on by default. Standard 3D lights do not do any kind of realistic bouncing like real lights do. So we'll close this down, and we'll fix that with additional lights later. In the meantime, I'm using Mental Ray, but you'll notice I've got this set to shadow map. And Mental Ray, as the name suggests, is really really designed to work with ray tracing. It's what it does well. It's what it specializes at. So I'm going to go ahead and change my shadow mode to ray traced shadows. Do another render, and you'll notice that our shadows look crisper and sharper, but we have another problem here, and that's that we've lost that shadow from our building. And one of the reasons for that is probably again due to the normals. We flipped them inside, and so it's not seeing that outer frame anymore. So let's fix that now. I'll open up my slate material editor. I will find the material that I created that has our wall, and that's this guy here. And I'm going to come down and select two-sided. Close that out. We'll try another render. And there we go, that's fixed that problem. Alright, so nice sharp shadows. Detail is showing up here where we created these nice beveled edges, and you can see that nice detail along the top there of the chest of drawers. And yeah, that's looking not too bad. So the next thing really is to perhaps try and soften up this shadow. So let's close this down. Now unfortunately you can't actually take a ray traced shadow in 3D Studio and apply softness to it like you can in Maya, for example, or at least when you're using Mental Ray. There is the option to use advanced ray traced shadows, but if you do a render with this on, you'll notice you get an error, and this essentially tells you that advanced ray traced shadows aren't supported in Mental Ray. So that's a shame, because you have the option to let's see, if we come down to advanced shadow parameters, ray trace parameters, you'll notice that you have the option to do shadow spread, but unfortunately that's not going to work for us, so we'll have to step back to shadow maps, but this time we'll use Mental Ray shadow maps. So these have been optimized for our Mental Ray renderer. Let's do a quick test render here, and you can see we need to increase the resolution of this shadow map. So let's go down to shadow parameters. You can see the map size here. Essentially it's looking through the light and it's seeing where the light hits and where the light misses, and it draws that on an image map, just like a texture. And right now the resolution is pretty low, so let's bump it up to 4K and do another render. There we go. We got those sharp shadows again that are more reminiscent of those ray trace shadows that we had before. And if we actually take note of this sample range parameter here, which is set very, very low right now, which is giving us these sharp shadows, we can increase the size of this and do another render. And you'll notice that it's actually starting to spread out and soften the edge of that shadow. So let's increase that a little more. And if we increase the number of samples, that'll give us more accurate softness. That's looking pretty good. So I think we've probably got as far as we can with this single light, and it's now time to start adding in some secondary bounce lights. As I look through my perspective view then, let's actually consider adding in some simple omni lights. So we'll go to our light tab again, standard, and we'll do omni. Place one of these in here. And the worst thing you can do is just add light after light without tweaking the values first. You really want to try and optimize everything you can about each light, try and get the most bang for your buck before you move on to the next light. Early 3D packages could only support, a minimum number of lights, and you really want to try and keep that mentality. Just because you can add lights doesn't mean that you should necessarily. So let's come in here, let's consider where this light's bouncing around. Perhaps consider putting it somewhere like here, and we'll call this fill 1. And we don't need shadows at this point, because really this is just for bounce. So let's look at intensity. And actually, before we adjust that, let's do a quick render so we can start doing some comparisons. Alright, so our intensity is too high, and we've got some pretty strange results going on in here, so we may have to look into fixing that later. But for now, you know, that's not looking too bad actually. And I think what I might actually do is just push my camera in a little bit so it's we've got a better composition going on here. So one thing I might actually do to make this a little easier is just go into my viewport settings and configure viewports. And one way to do this is actually just to go to your safe frames. And I just use, instead of action or title safe, I just use user safe. And I don't actually do any kind of percentage reduction on that. You click OK. And once you've done that, you'll have to go to your camera and you'll have to go to show safe frames. And there you go, you can see we've got our user view that we set up, and this is going to match our render view. So it's easier for us to position that camera so that it matches what we're going to see at the final render. So perhaps let's zoom this in a little bit. Bring this in. I think that's pretty close. Do another render. That's a little more intimate, it's a little more interesting. So let's see if we can fix this area here. It's probably something to do with my shadow maps that I've got going on here, and that could be a problem. It's probably to do with the way this shadow's cutting in here. There we go. So I just bumped that light up a little bit. That's one of the drawbacks of using shadow maps, is they're just not as accurate, and you can run into little problems like that. But of course ray trace lights have their own issues as well. But there we go. I think we're getting pretty close there. So what I might do is in fact just lower down that Omni light just a little bit so that we pick up these darker shadows again, and then maybe add another Omni light from this side, and that I can use to just kind of flesh out the light all the way around. So let's go to our perspective view. Let's pick up our Omni here and perhaps just lower down the intensity here. Let's go to try 0.7. There we go. And I really would kind of like that sunlight to be a little bit more sort of intense, to kind of light up that area there. So perhaps I'll pick up that sunlight and also go to its intensity. Maybe I'll increase that to something like 1.3. Let's keep going with that. There we go. So that's kind of getting there. And I'll come back in and add another Omni light, and hopefully that'll fill out the other side. And a good starting point can often be to just Control V, make a copy of your existing light. Maybe we'll just bring that up here. Probably lower this multiplier right down, something like 0.4. There you go. Although perhaps it's a little blown out here, so perhaps I got a little carried away with my sunlight. So I'll keep on tweaking this until I feel I've got it, you know, roughly as close as I can. And finally, this is what I've come up with. You can see I really just continue to tweak my lighting, and also I've made some adjustments to some of my shaders here just to make them look a little bit more interesting and just to allow me to pick up some more of the detail here. It's not what I would call, you know, polished and finished, and I think it serves as quite a nice refresher to get us sort of back into 3D Studio. I think overall, given the simplicity of the lighting here, this would probably be as far as I can take this, but overall I'm quite happy with the result. But I think the next step here really would be to start working with more advanced lighting techniques, and really I'm thinking global illumination, sending photons, you know, energy out from your lights, and calculating the bounces around the room, and also technologies like Final Gather, where we can actually send photons out from the camera and then kind of find all those nooks and crevices where the light can't get to. And that gives this sort of extra dense and accurate shadow map that sort of fits over the entire scene. But really, I think this is kind of a fun starter project, and thank you for watching, and I hope this is useful for you.